We welcome Laila Lalami back to our stage. She presented her first novel right when this space opened in March of 2019, and we are so excited to bring her back to discuss her new novel, The Dream Hotel, with author Rumaan Ulam. Sorry, got it tricked. So I want to welcome both authors and bring them onto the stage with a round of applause.
Hi. What a nice crowd. We were talking upstairs about how we were going to do this, and then I got distracted, and now I don't remember what we decided on. I think you should read from the book, but do you want me to do the synopsis before you do the painful? What I said to Layla is that I feel like it's very painful to ask a novelist to write 300 pages and then go on tour and describe the book in one sentence or less. So I'm going to do that for her. Don't grade me on this. The Dream Hotel, Laila Lalami's new book, is a novel that takes place in an unspecified future, in an unspecified place that is a prison, but not exactly a prison, in a California that is on fire, which feels familiar, in a society in which technology has its control over almost every aspect of daily life. I'll leave that up to you to decide how familiar that feels. The protagonist of the book is a woman named Sarah Hussein, who has been detained for the offense of having an inner life. The Dream Hotel follows her through her detainment at the titular Dream Hotel. But I'll let Layla read, which I think will be a better introduction to the book.
Can you all hear me? Hopefully, yes. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Rumaan, for doing this. It's very sweet of you. I tend to read standing, it's a habit, so this will be short and will require no setup. The dream cedes to reality, or perhaps it's the other way around, and she pulls herself from the tangle of sheets and stumbles into the hallway. There she waits, barefoot on the cold floor, until the bell stops ringing. She stands still, limbs straight, eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. If Madison has taught her anything, it is that compliance begins in the body. The trick is to hide any flicker of personality or hint of difference. From white domes on the ceiling, the cameras watch. The others line up alongside her, rubbing sleep from their eyes, squinting under the chrome-plated lights. The fixtures date back to 1939, when Madison was a public elementary school, enrolling as many as 400 children every fall. Back then, the town of Ellis had a farming tool factory, a movie theater, a thriving pool hall, 2 modest hotels, and natural hot springs that attracted tourists from 90 miles away in Los Angeles. A century later, the factory had shuttered and the springs were dry. The school sat empty, its walls spotting with mold, until the city council sold it to SafeX. Because of legal constraints on renovation, Madison's new owners had to keep the original lighting and metalwork, but they threw away the blackboards, stripped the state maps and alphabet posters from the wall, auctioned off the furniture, and converted the second floor into a ward. When they brought her to her cot in 208, the smell of industrial floor cleaner made her ill. She wrestled with the window, her knuckles turning white, before she noticed that it had been welded shut. But these days, the smell of synthetic pine doesn't bother her as much. Living with strangers in bare rooms, showering next to them in open stalls, standing behind them in line for the compods, all these have taught her to be alert to more intimate scents. From 4 feet away, she can smell the cream her roommate rubs on her skin to treat the rash she developed in the jail. The attendants bristle when one of the women calls Madison a jail. This is a retention center, they say. It's not a prison or a jail. You haven't been convicted. You're not serving time. You're being retained only until your forensic observation is complete. How much longer, someone will always ask. Depends, the attendants say. Some retainees stay just 21 days. Others have to stay a bit longer. The attendants never call the women prisoners. They say retainees, residents, enrollees, and sometimes program participants. Hinton comes through the gates 7 minutes after 6. There must have been some traffic on the highway or a delay during the security briefing. This morning, his hair looks freshly cut, bringing out his high cheekbones and bright, hungry eyes. But his fine features are muddled by the burn scar that runs along the base of his neck, just above the stiff collar of his uniform. The scar is a frequent subject of gossip at Madison. Some people say Hinton was injured in the Tahunga complex fire, which burned his house to the ground and killed his dog, supposedly a German shepherd. Others point out that the scar looks old, so it must be the mark of a youthful accident, a mishap with a firecracker, say, or a brawl around the campfire. Who knows? But the scar gives him substance, rescues his looks from bland perfection. Unhurriedly, he makes his way down the hall. At 2:02, he berates 2 retainees for a towel lying in a heap on the floor. That it must have slipped from its hook on the wall doesn't matter. They're responsible for keeping their quarters tidy. There's another issue in 2:05, something about an overflowing wastebasket. But it's only at 2:07 that his vigilance pays off. He finds, under a blanket, a battery-powered nightlight, smaller than a fingernail. Staying awake past 10 is against the rules. Everyone knows that. You people amaze me, he says, whistling in mock admiration. From his breast pocket, he pulls out his Tecmarian and touches the screen to file a report. It's like you're not even trying to lower your scores. 2 more steps, and he'll be at 2:08. She can already smell the instant ramen on him, made with hot water from the tap and slurped at his desk before the start of his shift. Does he know he's the object of so much speculation? Does he care? Perhaps he gossips about the women too, when he eats lunch with the other attendants, or when they're bantering in the locker room after a long shift. One thing is certain. Hinton takes pride in his work, always handling device check in the morning rather than delegating it to a junior attendant. He never rushes through it, even when all the women are standing in the hallway, shivering from the cold. No matter how long he takes to get to her, she doesn't lower her head to make it easier for him to reach behind her ear. It's a small thing, but it's what she can do to signal her resistance. He points the scanner at the back of her skull, and the scanner gives a beep, indicating that the neuroprosthetic on retainee M7493002, username Sarah T. Hussein, hasn't been tampered with overnight. She's about to turn around when he asks, "What's the matter?" His eyes are direct, unblinking. "You look a little off today." How can he tell? But keeping her mouth shut is another thing Madison has taught Sarah. A response, no matter how anodyne, might be used against her. She waits, hoping her face is blank enough until he moves on to her roommate. Now the day can begin. It is a frigid morning in October, the morning of her 38th birthday.
I have a bunch of questions here for Laila, but the audience will also be invited to ask questions. So if you have one, hang on to it, and I'll hand it over to you in like half an hour. My first question for you, actually, is I'm curious about the genesis of this book and when exactly you began writing it and what sort of the journey was to get to this finished product in my lab.
Yeah. So the book started in 2014. I overslept. I had overslept one morning, and the first thing I did is I reached for my phone to see what time it was. And when I looked, I saw a Google notification that said, if you leave right now, you will make it to the name of my yoga studio at 7:28. Now, I had never told Google what what time of day or what day of the week or even that I went to yoga. But obviously, having followed my movements, it had learned that typically every Tuesday and every Thursday I went to that yoga studio at 7:30. And I was understandably quite disturbed by that. It was
That's a true story.
yes, it is. Why would I make it up? I make up stuff in the novels. It's I was just really disturbed, and it really felt like a peek behind the curtain of surveillance. And I was disturbed especially by how granular the data that Google had collected was. And I remember I turned to my husband and I said, well, pretty soon, the only privacy any of us are going to have left is going to be in our dreams. And then I kept thinking about that. Is that true? Is it true that the only privacy we're going to have is going to be in our dreams? And right about that time, I can't remember if it happened before or if it happened after, the magazine Slate ran a story that said that obviously Facebook collects a lot of data about all of its users. I had read somewhere that it had as many as 1 million data points about each of its users. But in any case, what this article said is that it was also keeping track of keystrokes, meaning even if you didn't post that particular update, it actually knew that you had typed what you typed, went back and decided, I'm not going to post it. Like it still had that information, which in a sense to me suggested it had access to your thoughts, right? It had access to what you thought, but you decided not to post, in addition to what you thought and decided to post. That sort of psychological negotiation you're making with yourself, they have access to that. And so I thought, well, maybe it is true that the only privacy we're going to have is going to be in our dreams. And it struck me that dreams have so much in common with fiction because, every night we enter this deeply intimate world whose images only we can see, right? In the same way as when you read a novel, the images that you have in your head are your own. They're, obviously I wrote it, but like the images are yours. And that sometimes that the world of the dream can be tightly plotted, but other times it can be free flowing and just a series of images and kind of like a character study almost. And it's also very free. It's very creative. It's the place where you can be as daring as you want to be, but untethered from the judgment of anyone. So again, it's felt like it was like fiction. And I thought, well, how interesting would it be to bring this world of dreams with all of its free-flowing creativity and freedom in conflict and conversation with the world of algorithms, with their rules and their sort of mathematical thinking and sort of closed logic, right? So algorithms have a particular logic that they obey, but they don't know how to get out of it. So if you bought a pair of slippers off of Instagram, for example, the algorithm is going to continue showing you slippers until the end of time. Even though you're all set, you already have your pair of slippers, right? So it's because they are obviously very enclosed and are not able to make inferences in the way that we might make inferences. So I thought that that was a good idea, and I decided to kind of start working on it. But the story that I imagined was set in the tech world, and I found that the character I had for it, I just wasn't in love with the world that, like, of the tech industry. So after about 70 pages, I felt like I had run out of steam, and that I just didn't see my way forward in the book. So I set it aside, and I had another idea for a novel, and I just decided to write that one, and that was The Other Americans, and it came out in 2019. And so then when I was getting ready to tour the paperback for Other Americans, when we went into lockdown, and I had nothing else to do, and I I pulled out this old manuscript and I thought, well, maybe I can do something with it. And I salvaged 2 pages or 3 pages from it, which were the 3 pages that basically kind of describe how the device works in this world. And then I reconceived it. And I remember it started with this section that I read, which is I had this image of somebody coming out of their room, which is really not a room. It's more of a place where they're confined. And how did they get there and what happened to them? And that's how I started. And that's how the character started. And then once I had the character and I was kind of in love with her, then it was possible to kind of move into the book. And then I wrote it straight through until I turned it in 2024.
In a way, so as you initially conceived of it, it would have been sort of the story of the technology from the people inside of the technology. But the way the Dream Hotel functions is that Sarah, the protagonist, is sort of a proxy for the reader, and our relationship to technology, because presumably at some point you clicked some box allowing Google to follow you to the yoga studio and then mention to you, hey, you should get up out of bed. And we have all done that. And so Sarah, the protagonist of this book is detained really, not imprisoned. And the reason that she is because at some point she started using this device that has a medical application.
Right.
And in clicking that box that we all click when we get our new phones or whatever, we do this dozens of times a day. My children do it like dozens of times a week. I don't know what they're agreeing to, but I see it because they're on the family plan, so I see that they've agreed to all of these things. Like, who knows what they're agreeing to? And this has disastrous ramifications in the life of this woman, because what happens is that you use the word surveillance, but it's sort of a corporatized surveillance, that a corporation is able to see into her psyche, into this sort of private part of the self, and determine that this person is dangerous. You mentioned The Other Americans, the novel that you sort of wrote. First of all, it's pretty baller that you were like, oh, maybe I'll just write another book. Maybe I'll just come back to this 10 years from now. As an aside, I'm impressed by that. But the Dream Hotel seems very different to me in its endeavor. And I was trying to think about why that was. And it's sort of boring to talk about genre, but it's salient, I think, because this work feels distinct from maybe the realism of the rest of your novels, even the historical fiction. I wonder whether you were thinking about that as is this a work of speculative fiction or science fiction, or is it a work of realism? Was that question of interest to you as you were writing?
No. Is the short answer.
Good, that's a great answer, because the genre is kind of boring to talk about. Right?
No, but I will expand on that. What I meant is that no, in the sense that when I was working, I wasn't thinking through, oh, it's a different genre than the other books. But I knew that this was going to be a question that came up when the book was published, just because I understand the world that we live in, and people are going to be like, this is speculative, and the other one was, more contemporary, and the one before that was historical. And I think of fiction as a place of exploration and discovery. And oftentimes I don't really know what I'm doing until I'm doing it. And because it's a place of exploration, once I have figured out how to do something, I'm done with it. And I get bored. So it would, working on a historical novel, I learned a lot about historical novels while I was working on the Moore's account. But the last thing I wanted to do was write another one like that. Maybe in 2 or 3 novels down the road, I might go back to that. But I didn't want to do it immediately after. I wanted to get away. And I also thought, I don't want to do research for 5 years. I just want to write something contemporary. It still took me 5 years to finish the next one. But you kind of have to lie to yourself before you start writing a book. And then with this one, it really did make me hesitate that it was set in the future. But once I found the character and I was committed to it, I was locked in, as the kids say. And and then I went with it. And I do think that they actually do have something in common. So, for example, a historical novel, like a speculative novel, seeks to create a world that nobody alive has seen. And so it has to find a way to make that world feel real to the reader through like strategies that you use to kind of immerse the reader in that world. So they do both involve a lot of world building. And I had that experience from the Moore's account that I was able to use with this one to find ways to really immerse the reader into a world that is different from our own. And then the realism came in the sense that I wasn't interested in writing a novel that's set in like 2200, where it's very safe for somebody reading a book to say, this is so far out in the future. I can read this and there is no danger that any of this could ever happen to me. It's a very safe reading experience. But I really wanted it to not be a safe reading experience. And so I found ways to make it, even though it's set in the future, it feels familiar because through the world building, I sought to connect the future to the present and to make it feel realistic. So I do see the threads that tie these novels together, even if genre-wise, they might look different.
And it's not, I mean, to be fair, it's not like there aren't spaceships whizzing by and it's not, most of the action of the book is a woman in a prison. Yeah. So whatever
retention center
in a retention center. So whatever is sort of happening technologically is happening outside of the sort of main action of the book. And as much as I've seen critics talk about Philip K. Dick in their writing about The Dream Hotel, I've also seen them talk about Kafka, because both kind of feel salient with this particular book. I want to talk about Sarah, who is, I'm like never sure. I don't believe in spoilers. Like I don't care if I know what's going to happen in a book, but like the publicist is going to kill me if so I'm not going to spoil what happens in the book. And it's also very rewarding in this particular book to sort of get to the discovery on your own. But Sarah's detainment is unfair and is predicated on a misunderstanding and also her maybe ill-considered behavior.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
In a moment where she ought to be really dignified and negotiate her way out of basically like a run-in with the TSA. She is instead a human being and is sort of short and
defiant.
Defiant, yes. I was going to say disobedient, but defiant is the better word. And it's funny because part of the reason this like got to me so much is that we have a standing gag with my children who are teens when we go to the airport that Daddy always has trouble at the airport. And I do. I always have trouble at the airport. You can see I look like a real jihadi. And the last time we were flying to California for Christmas. My husband is white and our sons are black. So my husband had gone through security and I was...
randomly selected.
Well, I'm always randomly selected and I was handing over, my son has an EpiPen, so you have to hand them the EpiPen to be scanned separately. And my older son tried to walk through the gate and the security guard started yelling at him and said, no, the parent has to go with him. And I was like, well, my husband is right there. And my son, who's a teenage boy, got like really like huffy and was like, why is she telling me what to do? My dad is right there. And I had that moment where I was like, I could yell at this woman. I mean, first of all, she's just an agent of like a horrible bureaucracy and it's not her fault, but she was a total bitch. To be fair, it was Christmas Day, but I was like, surely you're getting paid overtime. Anyway, in that moment, I was like, well, I can't yell at this woman because it's just not gonna go well for me if I do. And that's sort of the dilemma that Sarah gets sort of ensnared in. And I love that because Sarah is not... There's a way of talking about contemporary fiction that seems very prevalent among readers about the likability or unlikability of the people they meet on the page. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you think of that. And I'm wondering what you think of Sarah and the metric of her likability.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. She's I would say she's a difficult woman, but I come from a long line of difficult women. And I would like to think that I'm most of the time very pleasant to be around, most of the time. And I would say that she is the same, most of the time very pleasant to be around. But I think, everybody has a bad day. And the thing is that when you're in this bureaucracy, you're still, you still have rights. And yes, those rights have to be respected regardless of how they feel or what kind of a day they're having. You're protected. Like, you have rights that at least legally you're supposed to be protected. And I think,
But if you get to the point where you're saying I have rights, you've kind of lost.
yes. So she in her encounter, she does say a couple of ill-advised things that perhaps if a white person said them, they might get away with, but not her. And so that, it's one thing after another, and basically that's what causes her to be detained. But throughout the book, you do see that sometimes she has a short fuse. And most of the time, she keeps it under control. But then when she loses it, that's what gets her in trouble. But that is the stuff of fiction, right? It's what trouble are you in? That's what gets the story moving. Part of the reason why the book starts in, or the trouble literally starts in an airport, is because, like you, I have a Muslim background and I have had that random selection and been pulled into the special room and that SSS code on the boarding pass where they look at you, and as soon as they see that, they kind of take a double look, like they and so when I was thinking about how did this person end up in this room, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. Like, it's obvious, like, this is one of the ways that I can get this person into this room, is to get her in trouble at the airport. And then it gets, that's how her detainment starts. And I love how that whole encounter starts, because it starts out quite pleasant. Mm-hmm. And then it just kind of keeps getting more and more complicated. And to me, I think what makes it so, what made it so fun to write, actually, is to kind of peel, like, the layers of an onion. This person that looks very ordinary, and as you start going through her life, as she's answering questions, you discover more and more details about her that make her more complicated than you thought she was. I really think that anybody's life, if you look at it with that kind of bureaucratic, governmental look, and with the backing of state power behind you, you would find things about their life that are quote unquote, problematic or illegal or whatever. And so the kind of trouble she's getting into is not fantastic, and it doesn't have to be, to land her in this place, because it is a world of surveillance, and surveillance is not neutral, right? So in this particular case, she's getting pulled. That's why she suspects, am I getting pulled because my name is Hussein? Like, she has an idea that that's why. Yeah, so.
But interestingly, I didn't feel like the book is entirely engaged in the question of race or racial profiling. It's not. It's much more interested in what you just said, which is state power and corporate power, which they're sides of a coin. But it was interesting to me that the way the book chose to, I may be misremembering, but I don't remember her like articulating, oh, I understand exactly what's happening. And it's all this misunderstanding predicated on my identity or myself. The book is much more interested in dissecting the ways in which corporate power and state power collude.
Well, I think it's both. So the book absolutely takes corporate power, which is the device that she has that helps her sleep and that gives this corporation access to her dreams. That data is sold to the government, and together, government and corporations are the two forces that place her there. But part of the reason that the book kind of plays on the idea of race and class and all of that is that when you think about technological surveillance, not other forms of surveillance, but particularly technological surveillance, it is universal, right? Every person in this room carries a device that, you know, is collecting data about them. Now, big tech has laid claim to that data. It says that data belongs to us. Your data belongs to Google and Amazon and Apple and so the big five. And so there is a universality to that surveillance that the book aims to make very clear. But it's also engaging with who is in that retention center. Who exactly is in that what kind of people end up there? And you start to see when she is questioned about her risk score. So part of how people end up in these retention center is that everybody has what's called a crime risk score. And if you go above a certain limit, that's what lands you in retention. And there is obviously a little bit of leeway, right? So if you're just like a point or two above, nobody's going to pull you aside. But if you are, you know, of a particular race, as in her case, then yeah, you do get pulled aside. So it is replicating the sort of the role that race and gender and class play in surveillance, but it is replicating it within the universality of technological surveillance in that center. Because she's a woman, everybody in the retention center is likewise a woman, and so there is a lot of like surveillance of their bodies and their more. But it absolutely also engages with race and class of the people who are.
I guess it sort of does it so. It sort of
Subtly.
does it seamlessly
Yeah.
for every kind of reader. So it's a strange thing. I mean, you mentioned this on social media. It's like a strange moment to publish a novel like this. It's sort of, yeah, wry laughter from the audience. You know, Mahmoud Khalid, who was a graduate student, recently a graduate student at Columbia University, was detained, and the administration is trying to deport him under some sort of like flimsy legal pretext that is clearly, you know, obviated by the First Amendment. When you thought about this thing a decade ago, did it seem outlandish to you? And does it seem strange to you now that some of what you devised as fiction feels like just headline?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, free Mahmoud, right? It is eerie and strange. I thought of the book in 2014, and the idea and the device and kind of like this future world was conceived under the Obama administration, and I wrote this book entirely under the Biden administration. I was not thinking of any party or whoever was in charge. I'm like the forces that are at play here have to do with corporate power, with the power of big tech, and its involvement with our government, right? So I live in California. If you run for the Senate or for the governorship, it's virtually impossible to win unless big tech, people in Silicon Valley, are okay with you becoming a senator because they have so much money to spend, and they spend it to help, you know, decide certain races. So, you know, big tech plays a huge role in the government. I did not imagine, I have to tell you, that an unelected billionaire would be roaming around the White House and would be trying to shrink the government, because it seems so cartoonish. And so it wouldn't seem like something that you would come up with a novel. Within a novel, because in a novel you always have to kind of turn the dial down, because otherwise everybody's gonna be like, oh, I had to toss it, it's too unbelievable. And so that's why I had to work, like I had to actually work hard to think through how this might happen. And in the world of the book, I imagined an emergency that leads to a Patriot Act like Crime Prevention Act that happens in the book that leads to the creation of these crime risk scores. And now I forgot your question.
Well,
I went
no,
off on
I
a
mean,
tangent. I do this all the time.
it's fine. doing a book tour is like running for office. You know, it's hard to stay on task. But
Yeah.
I guess that leads me to like an even bigger question, which is like what is the point of a novel? And
Oh, I see.
is the American novel
No,
is the
it's
American novel equipped for this political moment?
yeah.
And do you consider like politics within your remit as a novelist? And like, if so, not what are you trying to say? Because I think it's pretty legible to anyone who reads the book, but why? Like, what's the aspiration for you?
Well, to the question of politics within the novel and do I consider it? Absolutely, because I think that life involves politics, and people who don't believe this are going to find out very soon when government is shrinking and nothing is working, exactly what role politics is playing in their lives. Fiction is Fiction, to my mind, is concerned with the emotional lives of characters, but those lives are absolutely affected by the world in which they live, including their politics. When people say, oh, you're a political writer, what they mean is that your politics are different than my own, and therefore they're salient and I can see them and they bother me. And I would rather that they would be like my politics and therefore would be invisible to me. But to that question, then yes, absolutely. And then to the role that novels are playing. Well, first of all, we have to claim that we want people to read novels because I want people to read my novels because I want them to feel moved by them, to feel just emotionally, to feel connection to the characters, to feel that sense of wonder and exploration that you get from reading fiction. I don't know if fiction has ever changed people's lives. It certainly helps them to see things more clearly, hopefully. But it doesn't mean that fiction's role is to lead to action. That is entirely up to individuals. I do think that we draw inspiration, perhaps, but I don't think that, humans have been writing novels for centuries and we still have the world that we have around us, right? So one of the things, though, I will say, and this maybe helps answer your question, is that when I was working on this book, there were times when I scared myself because it was, the surveillance was so overwhelming, right? But by the time I was done, by the second half, things get a little bit better. By the time I was done writing the book, I actually felt quite hopeful. Like this book made me less scared of the future because it made me realize that there is absolutely nothing special about the times that we're in. And it really connected me to what happened in the past, and it made me feel that because the past is essentially a collection of futures that did happen. This is one of a trillion possible futures, and our role is to stop this possible future from happening. And I think that we can do that by connecting to our power, right? And power is something that all of us have, and it can be consumer power, right? So maybe no shopping at Amazon or at Tesla, or and or civic power, right? So calling your reps or marching or demanding, and or it can be just cultural power. Power takes many forms, and I think that because technology gives us this world of convenience, it tends to lull us into relinquishing our power and to feel kind of like, well, what could I possibly do, right? I'm just one person, and it makes us feel actually alone when we're not alone. We live in community with others. And when we join our power with others, then I think it can magnify and grow.
That's interesting because I was actually going to ask you about your I was looking at the book again today and I was sort of surprised anew by the conclusion, which does feel like it contains the optimism that you just described. So while the book is like rigorous and at times extremely stressful, please know it's not a huge bummer. That's important as we try and sell it to you. A question that I'm always curious about artistically, sort of get off politics, is an individual novel's kind of family tree. Like what you were reading or thinking about, or what you feel the Dream Hotel is connected to in the sort of like on the shelves in the room that we're in.
It occurred to me when I was reading that section. So it ends with, it was the morning of her 38th birthday. The trial begins on his birthday. So obviously Kafka was a big, he was the first writer that when I had this idea, rereading Kafka was the first thing that I did. And then my editor, who's sitting here in the front row, suggested a couple of novels that also I thought were very useful. One was a book called The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin, and another was, and now I'm blanking it. It's The Fox Was Ever the Hunter, but the other one was The Hunger Angel by Herta Müller. So I read a lot of fiction that's set in these sort of confined spaces. So things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Guantanamo Diaries. That's nonfiction. But a lot of fiction that is like, how do you negotiate when your character is in a space like an asylum? Like, how do you keep the story moving? Craft wise, like what strategies do you use to kind of just keep things moving? This was a bunch of the novel was written in the present tense, and something I hadn't done before. So I read a lot of books that use the present tense. I go back to Coetzee all the time, so this was a good occasion to revisit some of that. And then just sort of thinking through dreams. There's a book I mentioned in the acknowledgements called The Third Reich of Dreams that I've been recommending to people. It's a very short book that I believe Princeton University Press is reissuing. And it was written by this woman who was living in Berlin in the early days of Hitler's regime, and was noticing anecdotally that people's dreams reflected sort of their anxiety about what was going on. And so she started sort of transcribing the dreams and mailing them away outside of Germany. And then when she left Germany in 1939, she collected all of them in a book called The Third Reich of Dreams. And it's really interesting because it gives you access to sort of the subconscious of people who are living under a totalitarian regime. And it really helped, like it opened the world of dreams to me, and it helped me think about like, what kind of dreams would Sarah be having? Like if somebody is being accused of being dangerous, does that mean that their dreams themselves would start reflecting that they are, accused or potentially dangerous? So that was a lot of fun, just, thinking through dreams and being able to write about them for the book.
One of the most impressive feats about this book is that nothing is more boring than hearing someone tell you about their dreams. Like, we've all like had a friend who's like, "Oh, let me tell you about this dream," and you're like, "Oh my god, this is so boring." My kids always like love to tell me about their dreams, and I'm like, "Are you just improvising this? Like, what? This is not interesting."
In fact, yes.
Right? But Sarah is incarcerated in part because of a dream that she has had, and this really is a spoiler, so I won't deliver it. But like, the nature of that dream is like incredible. It's really interesting, and I wonder if you had spent a lot of time thinking about Freud and thinking about dreams, or was that just a flight of fancy artistically?
Both.
Yeah.
I would say both. I had fun with it. I thought, I obviously dream a lot, and some of I started paying attention to my own dreams, and I thought, what would be a good dream that would make sense for the character because of her hobbies and the kind of life that she has. How would I be able to spin? And it's like writing a short story, right? That suggests something about the character. So it was a lot of fun.
It is very relatable for anyone in the room who's married. I'm supposed to ask for audience questions. I think there are people with microphones. So if you have your questions ready, don't be shy. In fact, it's very humiliating when no one asks a question. So ask a question.
They're very shy.
I mean, I have many more, but
Oh,
yeah,
there's a hand.
There we go.
Hi, thank you so much. You talked a bit about the books that influenced this book, the writing. Do you have any other forms of media, maybe films, music, that you listened to while you were writing this that helped inform the headspace that you would write it in?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the Michael Haneke movie, The Lives of Others, which I love and highly recommend. Um, let me see. By the way, if you ever have a chance to visit the Stasi Museum in Berlin, I also recommend it. So a lot of, I'm trying to think. I blank when people ask me things like this, but that obviously was top of mind.
The Stasi Museum is incredible.
It is.
Because it is like the Stasi just left one day, and that it's what's left. It's
Yeah.
absolutely wild, and it
Yeah.
happened in recent history.
Yeah, yeah, and there was also a really great, since we're on the subject of museums, there was also a really great exhibit at Harvard a couple of years ago on surveillance, but historically. So if you think about like how facial recognition came about, or crazy things like measuring people's skulls because you thought that this meant something about their propensity to commit crimes, like all of this was part of the same exhibit. So, but movie wise, that's the one that comes to mind.
Good evening. Okay, I wrote my question. Well, I have questions, but I'm going to ask a question to allow others to participate.
Thank you.
Okay. Are the antagonists in this book big tech, the government, and men? If so, did you give consideration to broadening the antagonists to include women who have been consumed by the patriarchy? If not, why not?
Thanks so much for your question. So, the retention centers in this book, like other places of confinement, so prisons, jails, psychiatric wards, places where people are held because of their being under because they lose their legal rights to make financial decisions. All of those spaces are gender segregated. So the fact that this takes place in a woman's retention center has to do with the fact that the character is a woman. There are retention centers where men are also being held for their dreams. So this isn't about like she's being held because she's a woman, but she's being held because of a dream that she had. The attendants who watch over them are for the most part men, but there is a senior attendant who's also a woman. And so, yes, it is bringing in women to into this world of like patriarchal surveillance in the book as well. So, if only it were as simple as men versus women, but things are more complicated, and indeed they are in the book as well.
I hope that's okay. Thank you so much for this book. I like somehow bought it in a airport 2 weeks ago before it was published, and I don't know how, but it was great because I got to read it and I was so excited about it. But yeah, I really, really appreciated this book and I've appreciated all of your answers. I'm an organizer and I'm also a writer, and I'm always thinking about like sort of this, you were talking about like the power of fiction and what it can do, and like, you know, fiction versus reality, and I don't know, all those things. And I'm always thinking about like how can fiction mobilize people and how can fiction like move people to do something. And I know a lot of writers hate this question, but I'm just going to ask you it anyways, and I hope you can bear with me because it just felt so applicable to this moment as was discussed. Do you hope readers will come away with any sort of, you know, message or belief or understanding or like motivation to do anything? And like, what are you hoping readers will get from this novel, if that makes sense?
I mean, for them to do something is not up to me. I mean, everybody has to do what feels right to their conscience. But what I would, hope is that people, by following this character, understand that they hold within them, as I said, the power to do something, that we are not powerless. Like, that's one of the things that when I finished writing the book, it really, really made me realize. That's why I had so much hope at the end, is that I see people giving up their powers very easily. And and so that's the one thing that I would wish, is that would people not give up their powers as easily as they could. So,
Thank you.
oh, there's one in the front.
Hi, and thank you for doing this. I was wondering in your book if there are lawyers in courts, you know, in a way, the courts are one refuge now. Mahmoud Khalil, the judge said today, no deportation. I spent part of the day today in Newark with Ras Baraka fighting this ICE detention center. There's a $1 billion project to build the first 1,000-bed facility there. And again, it looks like the courts can stop that in Newark. So I'm wondering if Sarah is her name, I haven't read the book yet, if she's trapped in this maze or if there are like courts and lawyers to help out or help her navigate through all of this.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. That's something I thought a lot about. Indeed, there are courts and there are lawyers. But the issue is what part of the law makes this possible in the United States. And I drew inspiration from the past. So there is a case called Wong Wing v. United States, and that is what I heard somebody nod, because that is, I believe, and please, if there are legal scholars here, they can correct me, but that is the case that established the principle of immigrant detention. Before that, immigrants were, if you were stopped, you weren't necessarily detained, you were released because it's an administrative violation. But starting with that case, they were actually held and confined and basically, punished for that, for immigration violations. We take that for granted today, but that wasn't always the case in the United States. And the reason that that happened is because in the case of this a Chinese American, or well, Chinese at the time, person, the court found that he was only being held pending his deportation, and therefore that his detention was not, quote, punishment in a legal sense. And therefore it was okay to hold him. And he stayed in prison for however many months it took, and then he was deported. And that's what established that principle, and that's when we have the rise of immigrant detention. The scholar at UCLA, Kelly Little Hernandez, who wrote this book called City of Inmates, is City of Inmates being LA, basically traces the history of prisons in Los Angeles, which is where I live. And that's when I was reading about that, and I thought, okay, that idea I can use in the future, the idea that this isn't exactly punishment. So there's a way that the book explains it. And hopefully, from what I understand from legal scholars, is possible. So,
And by the way, speaking of museums, there's a great Kafka exhibit at the Morgan Library in Manhattan.
okay, wonderful.
Really worth visiting if you're around for a day or two.
Next time I'm in, for sure. Thanks for telling me.
We've got time for one more question.
I loved your book. It was great. I have a question about the structure of the book, because I felt like as a reader, the structure was very immersive and impactful. I won't spoil anything, but in terms of understanding the process, one of the other questioners mentioned a maze. She's trapped in this maze physically, but as you're reading the book, you sense that she's trapped mentally as well. And as a reader, sometimes I would read a chapter or a page and be a little bit confused in terms of what, if this is real, if this is not real. And I know it was intentional, but in terms of writing and structuring the book and the process as a writer, did you always have it so mixed up? Or was it more linear, and then through the editing process, you change it up? Can you talk more about the process?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So particularly in the first 80 pages, I wanted the reader to immediately be engaged with what's happening to her. The bulk of the book is what happens in the retention center, so it felt right to me to begin with the retention center. And in the first part of the book, there we flash to how she got there. We flash back and forth to that. And that's a strategy that, in a way, I used in the Moorish account, because the expedition arrives in Florida, and then we find out through a series of chapters set in Morocco and Spain how my main character ended up in Florida. So it gives it a bit of energy to go into the book to do it this way, and I liked it as a technique, and so I used it in this book as well. And because I was doing this and going back and revising and kind of smoothing out the world building of the novel, I did keep track of what was where, but the order did not change. The order was always the same. It's just that the execution, I kept smoothing it through revisions. And it's absolutely intentional that there are moments where, because the book includes her dreams, that there is that sort of destabilizing effect where you're not sure, wait, am I in her dream or is this really happening? Because that is what is happening to her. And when you're confined as she is in this place and every day is the same, you do lose track of your reality. And so it felt appropriate to sort of the horror of what she's going through to create that doubt in the reader as well.
Thank you so much, Laila, Rumaan, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, thank you. You know, I've already sort of fanned about how much I love this book, so I hope everybody leaves with a copy. Thank you, wonderfully full room, all of you for coming out. And also, Laila will be doing the personalization line on the other side of this door. So please do sort of start our line here, and we'll get her all set up. Don't rush off. Grab a drink at the bar and continue the conversation, and just have a great evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.